Hello and welcome to Book Club Live. Thank you so much for being part of our book club tonight. I'm Helen Bagnon, one of the founders of also Festival and Salon London, where I'm sure I've met lots of you with us tonight, and also Book Club Live, which we started a couple of years ago, and the idea being that we got to have a book club with the author. We've been doing that in real life, but because of lockdown, we thought it would be a nice idea to move this into the digital world and do it online. So we have converted our flat into a studio and are broadcasting to you from there. This is our second one, and again, thank you so much for being part of it. The format, it works a bit like this. So I'll be talking to Hallie, the author, for about half an hour and asking her about her book and her work. We then have a small break of about 10 minutes, the idea being you can get a cup of tea, maybe a glass of wine, refresh your crisp bowl, whatever you want to have a really lovely time and relaxed book club as you want to enjoy it. And within that 10 minutes, the idea is that some of the ideas that we've spoken about and the questions and the themes we've spoken about, perhaps you can text in your questions or comments and things you want to say. When we come back together, I'll be talking to Hallie about some of the things that you've texted into us. The number for Book Club Live is in the email that you've received, so please do text in. And I say, get a chance to reflect on the book, but I know despite our best endeavours, Pauline and I, the books went in the post Friday. I know some of you've got them, but not all of you've got them. They will be arriving tomorrow, but we hope you managed to read the digital link that we sent to you. And don't worry, I'll make sure that there are no big spoilers, that we can talk a little bit more unusually, because we haven't all read the book, but it will not spoil tonight, I promise. And as this is a community, I just wanted to, if that's okay, say a few hellos to people. And again, if you want me to say hello after the break, please text in and I will. I'd like to say hello to Linz in Sao Paulo, Cindy L in the USA, Denise in Barcelona and her mum, Joan, in North Yorkshire, Lisa H and Kate B in London, hello. And also our Salon London members that I know are with us tonight, Anne R and W, Jill with a Y, Suze and Steve and Sylvia in North Yorkshire, hello mum. And also James and Rebecca, I've just heard, in Ibiza are joining us. Oh, Ibiza. So it just remains for me to introduce our author. So Hallie Rubenhold is an author and social historian, an authority on women's lives and in the past. You may know her from her previous book, Lady Wolseley's Whim, 18th century tale of sex, scandal and divorce, or Covent Garden Ladies, the extraordinary story of Harris's List. Or I hope you know her from the book tonight, which is the Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper, because that is our book tonight. So, hello, Hallie.
Hi, hello.
How is your lockdown going?
Oh, well, probably much the same as everybody else's. There are, good days and bad days, and days when I hardly notice I'm in lockdown, and other days where I'm climbing the walls. So pretty much the same as everyone's, I'd say.
Oh, I think we're going to try and really kind of, one of the things I found amazing rereading your book this week was how it really took me out of myself, and I hope that we'll get that experience from book club tonight. And I just want you to say thank you for writing and researching such an extraordinary book for us. Thank you, and for reclaiming the lives of Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Kate, and Mary Ann. Now, there's been so much written about their killer, Jack the Ripper, as he's known, but so little written about his victims. I just wanted to ask as my first question, how did you realise that their stories hadn't been told?
Well, I mean, gosh, I almost don't know where to start with that, because it's such a long. I mean, it's one of those things that was kind of hiding in plain sight. So. We always talk about Jack the Ripper, and we talk about who Jack the Ripper was and the legends of Jack the Ripper. But the interesting thing is we never seem to ever talk about the women. In our culture, in our society, the whole myth of Jack the Ripper became tied up in, basically a parlor game of trying to figure out who he was, trying to pin down his identity. And when I was looking to write another book, I wanted to write something about working class women's experiences in London, and especially in the 19th century. And particularly, I'm not sure how many of the readers out there are familiar with my first book, which is called Covent Garden Ladies. And that was a book about an infamous guidebook to sex workers in the 18th century called the Harris's List of Come-Garden Ladies. And the amazing thing about the story of the Harris's List was that it was the story of three people who created the list, but also the story of the women on the list and how they ended up in sex work, who they were. There were short biographies within the Harris's List. It was a guidebook, but it was a guidebook which kind of opened a window onto the ordinary lives of ordinary people in London. And that book went on to be a bit of a cult classic. And I thought, when I wanted to write my next work of nonfiction, I thought I'd like to go back to this idea of looking at ordinary Londoners' lives. And I thought, well, sex workers, that's a great place to start. And then I thought, well, who are the most famous sex workers in the 19th century? Well, that will be the victims of Jack the Ripper. And then I started looking for books about them, and I was just amazed that there was no major work which detailed the five women's lives independent of the story of their killer. So the five lives together, which was a full-length work. There's just nothing, and that really, really surprised me. And I thought, my God, I cannot believe there's been this gaping hole for so long, and something needs to be done about it.
It's such an incredible, it must be such an experience to suddenly realize that this piece of work you're looking for, it doesn't exist.
I know. It is incredible. It was incredible.
Can you set the scene for us? Some of us are listening in London, but lots from our list of people listening and people all over the world. What was London like in 1888?
Well, I mean, it was a city of two halves, and so it was a city of two halves, and those two halves were the haves and the have-nots. Of course, there was the middle class in between, but we tend to think of the middle class as being middle class today means you're much more secure than you were in the past, and that wasn't necessarily the case. You could still be middle class and still suffer hardship, but the have-nots really had not a lot. So living conditions were pretty shocking. You might find in places like Whitechapel or other pockets of poverty in London, and there were many pockets of poverty in London. So it's places that we don't necessarily think of, like the area around King's Cross was a slum. Places like parts of Chelsea and Westminster, which are now very, very expensive to live in, were slums. Parts of Notting Hill were slums, and you had these pockets of poverty literally all over London. And unfortunately, Whitechapel acquired a reputation of being one of the worst. But the housing that the poor lived in, today we would find absolutely shocking. So you might find a family of 6, 7, 8 people living in one room of 8 by 10 foot, with smoking chimneys, no reliable water supply, no clean water supply. Toilets didn't work. If there was a toilet in the hallway, quite often they were broken. Just the fabric of the building was crumbling. It was vermin infested. And so, absolutely deplorable conditions. And then also, a situation where it was very hard to get out of those circumstances if that's what you were living in. So, unskilled laborers or even skilled laborers were not paid very much. And so it was very hard, if you're living hand to mouth, to put any money aside to improve yourself. And, people suffered illness and they suffered setbacks and they went into debt and they found themselves, in a kind of spiral of poverty that they simply couldn't get out of. And it was worse for women, actually.
Yeah, and I really want to talk a little bit more about the housing and the situations for women. Before we go into that, I just think I'd really like to know from you, what have we been handed down from history about these 5 women? So, before we take a look at the 5, what is the public perception of the 5 when you started this project? What did we know about them?
Well, I mean, this is the interesting thing is, starting this, all of it was this exercise in really in myth busting completely, and starting this research. Basically everything that I imagined was uh what these women's lives were like, I found almost to be completely untrue, or there was much more nuance there than was ever really discussed. So and unfortunately a lot of what we have internalized about Jack the Ripper and about these women has come to us through Hollywood, and has come to us through the media, and things that have been written, novels, and fictionalization, and so for example, the major thing that I found that really blew my mind was that 3 of the 5 women were not working in sex work at all. There's absolutely no reliable evidence to suggest this whatsoever. And by reliable evidence, there there are documents which are reliable, such as court records, such as a very kind of clear trail of evidence. Police records in some cases, in the case of Elizabeth Stride, and Mary Jane Kelly, where Mary Jane Kelly, for example, her partner, talks about how he met her and her whole life, and where she came from, and then women came forward who had worked as her madam. So we know that, for example, she worked in the West End as in high class sex work, as opposed to we think of these women out walking the streets under the gas lamps, and that simply that's a Hollywoodized image of them. That's just not how their experience necessarily was. The other thing that was really fascinating was that 4 of the 5 women were killed in their 40s, and they had led very long, long certainly by average lifespans, by the standards of the period. Only Mary Jane Kelly was 25 when she died, and even 25 wasn't that young in 1888. And they came from a complete range of backgrounds. Elizabeth Stride came from Sweden. Mary Jane Kelly came from Wales. Catherine Eddowes came from Wolverhampton originally. Annie Chapman lived on a country estate. Her husband was a coach driver. So each one of these women had such detailed, fascinating lives to unpick. And in the past, the way in which they've been dealt with is just, by the media, is just to totally gloss over them, to gloss over their experiences, because the most important thing about these women was that they were killed. They were killed, so therefore we could give birth to the legend of Jack the Ripper. So Jack the Ripper's story starts with their demise, and it's such a gross injustice. It's such a disgusting way to look at human life.
And you write so evocatively about the 5 women, and you take us back to the story of their parents, and as a social historian, you just give us such a rich story of how they have lived their lives, and as you say, you take us from Grub Street to Gothenburg to Wolverhampton to Paris to to Whitechapel, and it's extraordinarily rich. But what does come over in all 5 of their stories, but for completely different reasons, is this idea of how precarious their lives were.
Yeah.
And how the smallest change in life circumstances could have the most devastating effect.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, life was extremely precarious for women, and this is one of the problems, that society was not set up for women to lead any sort of independent life. Especially working class women were wholly dependent on men within their families. So, this is not only their father, but, obviously when they get married, their husband, but it could be their brother, it could be their son. They had to be an adjunct to a household, a man's household, because women's work didn't pay. Women's labor was always designed to support a male breadwinner. So a woman could never be single and earning enough money really to comfortably keep herself. And nor was it expected that she would. The idea of being a single woman, I mean, almost no matter what class you were, was anathema. Because it was believed that men needed women and women needed men, and there was this division of labor. A man needed to marry for the same reasons that a woman did. A man needed to marry because he needed somebody to cook and clean for him, and mend his stockings, and look after his kids, and bear him kids and keep a house for him while he earned. He needed a servant, and a woman needed a man to keep a roof over her head. And that's how all of society was structured. So this idea that a woman could just kind of wander off and lead an independent life was, I mean, it was insane. It was insane to them. They wouldn't be able to even conceptualize that.
I think that's, that's for very different reasons. All five, Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Kate and Marianne, all seemed to offend this one idea of what it should be to be a woman in very, very different ways.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could, you actually describe, and I was really moved by your description of like separation from a husband at that time was to live a living death. Yes. And, I wondered if you could kind of just explain, a little bit more about, what were the options, the kind of the housing options, the lives that the five would have led when they struck out on their own, or if circumstances meant that they were striking out on their own.
Well, it depended. I mean, they were completely, if like a woman in general were to strike out on her own, first of all, you have to consider the circumstances in which she would be striking out. And in the case of Polly Nichols, it's, a marriage breaks down. Your marriage breaks down. The first place you have to go to prove need is the workhouse. You have to throw yourself upon the mercy of the workhouse. And in order to fully understand what that would mean, you have to really describe what the workhouse was about. And the workhouse was a shaming place. It was designed to shame people who had fallen upon hard times. So the idea was, that way you keep people out of the workhouse because they otherwise they won't do anything. The poor were considered idle. So people like Polly would have grown up with this very keen sense that they could never, ever, ever, ever ask for charity from the workhouse. It was a stain on them, on their person, on their morality. And so to go from a position where the workhouse was reviled to having to turn to the workhouse in order to prove need so that the parish could then go to her husband and say, look, is your marriage, obviously you want to go your separate ways. There are issues. You're going to have to pay your wife a maintenance because look, she has, nowhere else to go. And then that forces his hand to do it. She has nowhere else to go. So that's an incredibly demeaning experience for somebody who's always kept out of the workhouse, always tried to keep out of the workhouse. So that's one way in which a woman could then make ends meet. But the problem is, no matter if she was given a maintenance or not, society expected women to have a man. You had to be an adjunct to a man's household. You had to be. So, you could go live with your brother, or you could go live with your father, or you could go live with somebody else. Or what often happened to these women was that they found another man. And why not? Why not find another partner? That's what we do today. That's normal. And then they go and live with another partner. But what then happens is, because the marriage is a separation, but it's not a divorce because the poor couldn't afford a divorce, the woman then becomes an adulteress, and the woman is then a whore. And so society casts aspersions on her, and she's failed. She's complete. As soon as a woman walks out the door, she is a failure. She is morally defective. So that's the kind of world these women were walking into.
And that's why the conflation with the victims and the sex work has has sort of conflated with Victorian values, because, you know, there were no housing options if you weren't with a man. You know, you were going to be in temporary doss houses or walking to,
Yeah.
there was nowhere for you to be. You were going to be outside in a kind of unstable relationship, no nice home to go to.
No, exactly. And, you know, and the thing is this, I mean, it's the Victorian mindset was one which viewed that, as I call it, there's the broken woman and the fallen woman. And we know what the fallen woman is. The fallen woman is the woman who has any knowledge of sex outside of marriage. And the interesting thing about the Victorian era is, you know, they had these sort of rescue missions and these houses, reformatory houses, Magdalen houses, whatever you want to call them, which would take women in. And often it would be for this, you know, the streetwalker or the woman who worked in a brothel, you know, the sort of garden variety sex worker in the 19th century. But these places also took in women who were men's mistresses and, interestingly enough, victims of incest. So this is a definition. Okay, who is ruined? Who is a fallen woman? Any woman with sexual knowledge outside of marriage is a fallen woman. Okay, that's how the Victorians define that. Then there is what I call the broken woman. And the broken woman is the woman who has fallen foul of the ideals of womanhood. She's failed. She is morally defective. She is an alcoholic. She may have mental health problems. She may have split up from her husband. There may be all sorts of issues and reasons why that woman, for example, cannot have a roof over her head. And that woman is morally defective as the fallen woman. So Victorian society conflates them. Moral defect is defect of you know, your person, your entirety. And so you are a whore.
And so in writing the five, was your aim to reclaim the dignity of these five women who were judged broken by society and came to such a upsetting end?
I think I'd be very careful to use the word reclaim, allowing them, you know, what I don't ever want to make it seem like as if I'm saving them from, you know, the circumstances in which they lived. And anybody who's read the book will see that. What I want society to do, what I want us to do, our culture to do, is to recognize the worth in these individuals, in their stories, regardless of who they were, where they came from, what they did, that these are worthy stories, and these stories deserve to be told. And they were human beings, and they suffered, and they had small triumphs, and they had a life, they had an identity. And it's about giving them back their humanity, or allowing them to have humanity. And I think that is the most important thing that I think the book does.
It really does. And you give them a life that is so rich, you know, and the detail, the amount of research that has gone into it is quite astonishing. And there is something so unusual in reading it, because you know the end of the story. You know, there's no spoilers with that. You know what's
like
going.
The Titanic.
It's like the
Titanic is going to sink.
Yeah, and yet, you know, within the richness of the stories and investing in those characters who just spring out to life and are so different, and their lives are so, you know, extraordinarily different, and yet you can't help but think maybe it won't happen. You know, maybe this time they'll be, you know, because this feels like a real, you know, you have given such life to them, and, you know, and it's an extraordinary feeling reading it. It's almost like, you know what's going to happen to that character, and yet there's just a sense of you that just really hopes that it doesn't.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the process of writing it. I mean, obviously there was so much material on Jack the Ripper. You know, a huge amount, as you say, a huge amount has been published about him. But, you know, did that mean that there was a huge amount of material for you to find about the five?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's a huge amount of secondary source material. So there's a huge amount of writing about Jack the Ripper, and quite a lot of that is not, I mean, it is not well researched at all. And so funny thing is, when I started on this path, I thought, all right, well, this will be a fairly straightforward book to write, because, you know, I mean, so many people have done so much of the digging for me, and there are all of these books. And then I sat down with these books and I realized I'm going to have to reinvent the wheel, because, you know, most of these books weren't footnoted. And there are these claims that are made, and I have to, it became like
Weren't
peeling back
footnoted,
layers.
Hallie, weren't
Like,
footnoted,
yeah,
meaning.
well, I mean, like, so a lot of these books have been written about Jack the Ripper. They'll mention a source, they'll mention, or not even mention a source, they'll make a statement, and it's a statement. You think, where did they get that from? How where is that from? We need to understand context, we need to understand where this is from. And there was no footnote, so I had to go back through everything and locate where that statement came from. I mean, the amount of newspapers I went through for this, and in the course of that, you know, discovered a lot of things, which is most of this Ripper legend is based on newspaper reports, Victorian newspaper reports that have just grown into fact. Well, it's not fact, you know, and more importantly, you know, you look at 10 newspapers that have covered a story, and the way in which the verbatim quotes are written up is different in all of them. So which one is the definitive source? The problem is there is no definitive source for a lot of these claims. So this whole, like, everything we think we know about Jack the Ripper is actually based on very, very thin evidence. I mean, virtually nothing. So what I had to do was I had to really sort through all of this stuff and then go back to the real meat and potatoes, which is the documents, going into the archive. So looking at birth, marriage, death records, workhouse records, parish records, education records, army records, social housing record. I mean, just everything. And you can see in the bibliography of my book just what I looked at. And that's when you can build up a picture of biography of who these people were, what their lives were like. And then layering onto that, you know, for example, we may not know what Catherine Eddowes' experience giving birth in Yarmouth Workhouse in the 1860s was like, but we have other people's experiences of giving birth in Yarmouth Workhouse in the 1860s. So her experience would have been something like that. And so, you know, we look at it broadly. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, things like censuses. Censuses are incredible treasure troves. And censuses will tell you who was living in a house on a particular day at a particular date, who all the members of the family were, how old they were, where they were born, where they came from, what work they did. But it will also tell you something about the neighbors and the neighborhood. You know, what socioeconomic bracket was this? And then, you know, you can trace what happened to people. And in that, you get a real sense of kind of layering back on. So if you have the bones, you can start to layer on the flesh through a historical understanding of context and what was going on at various times in various places.
And you know, and that's what you do so well. And it's so confident in the way that you're building the structure of the lives of all these really disparate women. You know, at times you feel that you're in, you know, Dickens. At times you feel you're in Hardy, and you know, all the time you've just got this incredible, you know, factual basis for understanding history. It's just such an extraordinary book. Were there any real kind of like heartbreaking, extraordinary moments where you found something you just thought, I just can't believe that I've managed to find this piece of evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that really was quite an incredible find was Annie Chapman. So Annie Chapman, one of the most extraordinary things, bits of evidence that exists for Annie Chapman is this letter that was written, I think, to the Pall Mall Gazette, by one of her sisters after Annie died, and giving this whole kind of this potted history of Annie's life, and the family's life and what happened. And at one point, her sister says, you know, she tried to take the abstinence pledge. You know, her sisters were heavily involved in the temperance movement, and she kept it kept failing. She couldn't keep up with that, and then we put her in rehabilitation. And I thought, this is amazing, because there couldn't have been too many rehabilitation centers around at this time. And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to see if I can find which one this is. And then I'm going to see if anything exists. And I'm telling you, I had narrowed it down and made this list. You know, there were probably about 5 around at the time. This was one of the first women's rehabilitation centers. And I narrowed it down, and there was a place called Spelthorne Sanatorium. And it was run by, well, it eventually was run by, taken over by a convent of Anglican nuns. So not unlike Call the Midwife in that way. And I followed the history. Where did this go? Oh gosh, they're based in Wantage, and their convent is still there. And oh look, they've got a librarian. I wonder if I just send her a message, if she might. And she got back to me, and I said, look, I'm looking for these records. She said, well, we have the logbooks from this period. Why don't you come down and see them? And I just went, oh my God. And I knew, as my heart was racing, I thought, I'm going to find something. I'm going to find something. And so we drove out on a beautiful summer's day, much like similar to today, to Wantage. And all the while I was going, I'm going to find it. I'm going to find something. And I was going through the books, and then there it was, that Annie Chapman was brought to Spelthorne Sanatorium on the particular date, the whole year that she stayed, all the things that happened, that her husband came to visit her over Christmas, and then eventually a year later she was discharged. And that, to me, that was amazing. This, this dusty tome hidden away, that no one had seen, this chapter of Annie's life. I thought it was amazing.
Oh, it's an incredible story. Thank you so much, Hallie. We are half an hour has gone by. Thank you so much, Hallie. We're going to take a break now, and then we'll be back with questions from book club livers. Thank you so much, book club livers. I can see lots of things coming through. So I'm going to be getting those together and talking to Hallie about them in the break, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Please get yourself a drink or a cup of tea or whatever you want, and we'll be back talking to Hallie about the 5 in 10 minutes. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to Book Club Live with Hallie. Thank you so much. You've had so many questions come in. I'm not surprised because it's such a great book, and I will do my best to get your answers for you. Welcome back, Hallie.
Hi.
We are going to start with alcohol, although I am having a glass of water as per the temperance movement of the time.
So am I.
We're working. I hope everyone at home is enjoying themselves. So this is from Caroline in London. She's saying, loving the book. Thank you so much. And this was a question we had come through a couple of times, actually, from Jane as well. And it's she makes the connection that all five of the five eventually suffer with alcoholism, which is an escape, but also in some ways exacerbated their problems. And she wanted to ask if we, historically, do we have a good sense of their relationship with alcohol at the time, how and when they consumed it, and whether this was usual for their gender and class.
Well, it was. Alcohol was completely inescapable in the 19th century. It was in medicines. It was in household medicines. It was, the dram and the dose, as they said, were interchangeable. So if you were feeling a bit under the weather, you might take some medicine, which was heavily alcohol based, sometimes even laced with things like cocaine as well. And if you were feeling sad, you would have a drink. If you had a toothache, you would have a drink. If you were cold, you had a drink. If you had a cold, you would have a drink. And then also you have to think that people very poor people did not have the access to activities and the social life that we enjoy today, or people that even enjoyed even a bit later in history. So people went to the pub. That was the place where people congregated. And of course, at the pub, you drink. Now, later in the century, this starts to change a little bit. I mean, this is one of the reasons why you get things like working men's clubs and working men's colleges. And also the temperance movement has something to offer, in that there was a movement towards opening coffee houses in London, and coffee houses were places where you could go and you could enjoy the same conviviality, apparently, and not drink. You could get something to eat, and you could read the newspapers, and you could interact with your neighbors. And that was a change. It was a sort of way out of this cycle. But most people had alcohol in their lives all the time, even when, well, for example, the water was not safe to drink. And so people drank something called small beer, which was very low alcohol beer, because I couldn't drink the water. And so you learn to take this in, whether you have predisposition to alcoholism in your family, as Annie Chapman did. Annie Chapman's father was an alcoholic, her brother was an alcoholic, and so she, for example, couldn't get away from it. And also it was a way of just, if your life is miserable, this is a really good way of obliterating that unpleasant experience. And so it was also, so it was copious, it was everywhere, it was very difficult to get away from, and it helped you get through your life as well.
Yes, and it is Annie's story particularly. You would think that her situation now would be treated very differently.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great question. We've got a question from Sandra in North Yorkshire, and she's asking, Hallie, did you research all of the five concurrently, or one at a time?
Well, a little of both, actually. I mean, I learned as much as I could about their lives from secondary sources, and read as much as I could about them. I read about all of them, and then I started deconstructing that bit by bit. And sometimes I would have to do their research concurrently, because where I was going, I'd be looking at a batch of documents, and it's likely that, more than one of them would turn up in, the Thames Magistrates Court records, for example, or looking at censuses. But what I ended up doing was you start sifting them apart. And I remember there was one part when I was one time, well, not one time, a whole kind of elongated period of time where I was doing this research, and I'd be doing, for example, I'd be working on Polly Nichols, and something about Annie Chapman would pop up. And then I'd have to put that aside. And, so I was going in all these different directions. And I felt like I had 5 compartments in my brain, 5 pigeonholes. And to keep those stories in my head simultaneously, those 5 stories as they're constantly evolving, became exhausting. And it was wonderful to be able to not only write them down on paper and keep a very consolidated and thorough type of note, kind of, I was going to say package of notes, but it's more than that. It's, kind of files and files of notes. But what was even better was being able to finally sit down and take all of that research and take one woman at a time and write her story. And that's where the real nuts and bolts and the nitty gritty of their lives came to play, was how it was going to be arranged over those several chapters within that section. And it came as a relief to finally, when I got to the end of one of those sections, that's it. It's all down on paper. I don't have to carry it around in my head anymore. It was like laying down a burden.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. It's just thinking about when you say package, like I can't say package because I know how big.
Yeah.
I know how much of my living space is taken up with notes.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And, obviously on the computer as well.
I've got a question from Emily. Hello, Emily. How are you? Says, fantastic book club live. Thank you for the book, Hallie. And she says the book is so evocative of Victorian London, and she wants to know: did you visit everywhere in it? And if so, how did visiting it affect what you were writing?
Well, for the most part, yeah, I did. I mean, it's really, really important to go and see places and feel them, and also like kind of spatially to see, right, if their house was there and they went there, what would that walk have been like, what would they have passed, and looking at old maps at the same time and thinking about it. And hugely evocative. I mean, I remember at one point retracing the steps that Catherine Eddowes would have taken to go to school when she went, probably the route she would have taken over London Bridge to get to her school, which was at the Dowgate Charity School in the City of London, from where she lived in Bermondsey, and how long that would have taken, and what she would have walked by, and what it would have looked like, and that every day this would have been her journey. And you think about that, and it does put you in that place, and you think about all of the aspects of London at that time that somebody would be seeing and feeling and hearing and experiencing, because that's part of what a life experience is. That's part of being alive, is being in your physical environment, which is why it was so important to me to try to replicate that experience of being physically alive and physically in place in the book, which is why, a lot of people have said it's amazingly evocative, the book. It is kind of sights and sounds and smells. And yes, because if we want to know how these women felt, where they were, what they were doing, that's a very good indicator of what that would be.
I think that, and that word comes up. Emily used evocative. I think I used it earlier. It is it's almost like a psychogeography tour of London. I've been, so restricted in London in recent times, but we are going to the parks, and the park features in one of the stories, and it just is imagining, all those stories that exist, some that happened in that park. It's just bringing London to life so incredibly well. Thank you, Emily. I've got a question from Jo in Penge in South London. Hello, Jo. And she wanted to ask you, Hallie, was there one of the 5 whose story particularly moved you?
I get asked this all the time, and I have two answers, and one is yes, but well, so that I felt a very strong affinity towards all of them, because as I was going through, you feel like you get to know them, even though, I mean, the frustrating thing is because there are no diaries or letters or memoirs or things like that. You don't get that up close and personal, somebody writing about what they're thinking and what they're feeling. But you get this amazing, almost like ghostly outline of a life coming through the details of somebody's experience, where you can kind of, you get a sense of what the personality is like. And I mean, all of these women, I felt a connection to all of them and to their humanity, which was something quite profound as I was doing it. It was a very, very kind of profound experience. But Annie Chapman, I felt very moved by. I mean, I felt moved by all of them. I keep saying that. It's hard to, a mother mustn't have favorites, right? But I feel Annie's story really gripped me because it was so hard to get out of poverty, to claw your way out of poverty. And Annie's family had started to make the first upward strides towards a middle class existence. So they were lower middle class. And then she married John Chapman, who was a gentleman's coachman, and she lived on this country estate, and they had their own cottage. And and I actually went to the archives and I looked up the coachman's cottage and what, there were floor plans of the coachman's cottage and what rooms there were in the coachman's cottage. And like this, she had a parlor, she had a sitting room, she had a dining room, they had a scullery, they had a washroom, they had 3 bedrooms. This was a middle class house, and all of the aspirations that she had that went along with it. So obvious that Annie and her family had aspirations, and how alcoholism tore that family apart. And it ruined her children's lives, it ruined her husband's life, it ruined her life, it ruined her family's life. And how incredibly distressing, how deeply sad that was, because it was such an achievement to have got yourself out of a position where you were struggling financially all the time, and then to find yourself sliding back down. It is, it's terrible. It's heartbreaking.
It really was. And you do, you have that sense in all of the 5 that, the dice are kind of loaded from the start. And, particularly with Annie. And I think it's something we didn't talk about in our conversation. I was hoping to ask you, is this idea that all of these women have been through really severe trauma. Of loss of children, of really really significant life events that are very damaging and very difficult to process. And there's just absolutely no understanding of this in the way that they're treated.
No, definitely not.
No acceptance that this is almost impossible to recover from the loss of 5 children.
No, I mean, it would have been, I think people would have at that time realized and recognized, that it was terrible, and people were devastated when that happened. But, psychology as we understand it didn't exist. And there was no way in which, people could work through their problems other than to go to church. Then they might not even find the answers they're looking for, or even a sympathetic pastor or anyone who would have helped them. And it would have been incredibly difficult for people. I mean, especially I think about often Elizabeth Stride and the trauma. And I think this is one of the things that makes I felt her life so interesting, is the trauma that Elizabeth Stride experienced, having lived in Sweden and having been in a situation where she fell into basically kind of state-run prostitution in Sweden, because she didn't have any other options. She was single and pregnant, and therefore it was decided she was a prostitute, because only uh, single pregnant women could only be prostitutes. That's that's what you are. And so she found herself working for a short time as that, and ended up with syphilis, and she was pregnant, and she lost the child in the Lock Hospital being the venereal health clinic, where you are literally locked in. And she lost touch with all of her family. She was deeply, deeply shamed. Again, the whole process of doing this was to shame. Um, and eventually found her way out of that with the help of a woman who seems to have been some sort of reformer, and she worked as a servant in her house. But then obviously starts life over in Britain, and the trauma that Elizabeth Stride carried from that experience shows up again, I strongly believe, towards the end of her life and what she became. And I'm not going to indulge in any spoilers here, because I think I've probably spoiled enough already. Um, but it's I think that trauma is very, very recognizable in a lot of these women, and Catherine Eddowes too. I think, in all of these women you can see trauma.
Yeah, I think, and it's, obviously you can't judge the past by the way that we live now, but it is really helpful, because it any way that feeling empathy, I think just allowing us so many ways of feeling empathy for women by making them so vital, and so alive in your writing.
The other thing I was going to say, actually, about the trauma, and about what society did, which actually made things much worse, was that what we underestimate, because we don't have it to the same degree as they did in the past, but shame
Yeah.
was absolutely crippling. And it was if you sought help, quite often, I mean, through a charity, through even through a church, through the workhouse, the first thing that happened to you was that you were shamed. You were mortified and shamed. And so these women carried around with them the burden of shame that their society put on their shoulders. That, to constantly be told you were defective, you were bad, you did something terrible, um, and to carry that while also seeking some sort of remedy for what it is that they're experiencing. I mean, we know you cannot shame somebody and lift them up at the same time. It just doesn't work. But unfortunately, that's what a lot of Victorians, that's what a lot of Victorian missionary work, a lot of Victorian charity was about, was combining those two things together.
Yeah, it's yeah. Okay, yeah, you write about it so well, and it's just such a difficult concept for us to understand, but you really do get it across. The writing about the workhouse is just systematic change, shame, isn't it? Really.
Mm, yeah.
I've got a question from Suze in London, and she's talking about the relationships between families, the five and their families, because a couple of them do have families. She was saying, why was it the habit of their existing families, the brothers and sisters, to push away their difficult family members?
Well, that's really interesting. And I think especially in the case of Catherine Eddowes, who really had quite a difficult relationship with her family. Um, Quite often you have to understand, in impoverished households, there wasn't the physical room at all for somebody. You may be living in one room of about 8 foot by 10 foot. It just wasn't physically room for you. And that was the case with Catherine Eddowes. I mean, she had sisters, and she probably threw herself on her sister's mercy. We know that on many occasions, but she couldn't stay there because there wasn't room, and the family didn't have the financial means to support another person. And it was believed, if you could work, you must bring in an income, and if you can't bring in an income, then you're a burden on the family. And again, there's shame in that as well. And a lot of these people would have left of their own accord. That's the thing. Again, one of the things about what we don't understand is there's this whole cycle with the workhouse and the lodging houses, for example, where and the street and the casual ward. Okay, so the workhouse, we know what the workhouse is. You go in there when you have nothing left. Workhouse, in the workhouse, you can discharge yourself at any time. You can, it's not a prison, but you are treated in the same way a prisoner would be treated, in that, you know, you give your clothes over, you're given institutional clothing, you know, you have to work for your keep, and you're fed absolutely disgusting rations. And a lot of people chose, rather to than to submit to that shame and that misery, to take their chances on the street, sleeping rough. Um, and then when they felt, you know, they couldn't do that, again, they might go to the casual ward. The casual ward is like the mini workhouse, and the casual ward was set up to take in people who might be spending a night or two homeless. And it was the same sort of idea as the workhouse. You would get a bed, also vermin infested. Um, you'd be given terrible food, and you would have to do a day or sometimes 2 days of work, and then you would be released, and then you were free to go and find work. Well, if you couldn't find work, or you might be able to find work, a day of work, and then you'd have money to go and stay in the lodging house, which is, you know, 4 pence for a bed, and again, horrific conditions. Or you may find yourself sleeping on the street. And people were in this cycle. This was the cycle of poverty in the 19th century. And often before you went into the workhouse, they ask you a question: do you have anywhere else to go? Is there anybody else on whom you can throw yourself? And because if there was, the parish would say, right, well, this family who at this particular address, you know, your sister, whoever that is, you are their burden now. You're not the parish's burden. So you have to understand your family dynamics came into this. It wasn't just the lack of space, the fact that the money wasn't there to support an extra person, but it's the dynamics of a family as well. You've got somebody who's a real troublemaker in your family. You've got somebody, even today, somebody who's a drug addict. You may not want, even if you love that person, that person sleeping on your sofa for an indefinite amount of time. With all of the problems and in your inability to deal with it, and that is, that is not something that has changed. And if anything, it was far worse in the 19th century.
Yeah, and I really, saw that many times in the book, that the fortunes of a family could just be dramatically changed by one more mouth to feed, or by losing one older child's wages. Just those, things that would be perhaps not, would be manageable now, were just utterly devastating in the 1880s.
Yeah, exactly. It took one little thing to, so if you think of it, it's like a life raft. You have this family who's clinging on to this life raft, and one extra person throwing themselves onto the life raft could sink the whole life raft.
Yeah. I've got a question from Richard about Mary Kelly. And asking, I know that she was perhaps the most difficult to research, and he was just wondering if you'd been able to find anything new about Mary's life before the East End.
Well, I mean, before the East, this is the interesting thing. The one thing that I can tell you almost 100% about Mary Jane Kelly is that her name was not Mary Jane Kelly. And therein lies the whole conundrum, because, since the day that Mary Jane Kelly died, people have been trying to find out who Mary Jane Kelly was. And, there were police officers who went to Ireland because she said she was from Ireland. There were, was investigation in Wales trying to find her family. But the interesting thing is, by the time she was murdered, this was the 5th murder, the news of this was in every newspaper around the world. And so Mary Jane Kelly's story went international. It was everywhere. And not one single person came forward having recognized anything in Mary Jane Kelly's description of her life, of who she was, of where she came from, to say, I know that person, that's my whatever. Which leads me to believe very strongly. And also, nobody's ever been able to find a Mary Jane Kelly who fits the description that she gives, where the dates match up, even remotely, or anything else. And it's quite, I think I would say 90% of what she was saying probably wasn't true. But what we can read about Mary Jane Kelly are descriptions that people give of how she conducted herself and who she was. So there's one really important thing that somebody says. Well, there are a couple of things, but the one really important thing was one of the madams that she lived with said she was an artist of no mean degree. She could draw, she could paint. That type of education, artistic education, was not available to poor women from working class backgrounds at all. It's just simply, you would have had no access to that whatsoever. And that it was said that she held herself well, she was learned. She originally went into high class sex work in Knightsbridge. Now, what we know about the sex trade is that quite often, for you to go into the higher echelons, everything was stratified in the 19th century. You had to come from a class that was a little bit better than those at the bottom. So often the women who went on to become courtesans came from the middle class. Well, that would be wholly consistent with what we know about Mary Jane Kelly. So I suspect that may have been what happened. She had a relationship with a man. She made up a whole story. When she's hiding out in the East End, she wants to seem as much like everybody else as she can. But there are certain things that will betray her, such as one's education in the 19th century. You cannot disguise that. That will be in how you speak, how you carry yourself, how you walk, what you know. You cannot disguise that. And that's the one thing that always gives people away in the 19th century. So I strongly suspect that she was from some kind of middle class upbringing. I mean, it doesn't even, not even, wealthy middle class, but even lower middle class. But I suspect that's probably where she came from.
Oh,
though I don't think we'll ever really know the truth.
Oh, okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. Great question. Thank you. I've got a question from Anne Anne R in South London. Hello, Anne. And she wanted to ask your opinion, Hallie. Why do you think, as a society, we are fascinated by men killing women?
Oh gosh, wow. I think there's a certain frisson in that. I think there is this idea of doing things to a woman's body, of controlling and manipulating women, that somehow that is very sexual, that's very primal. It's about control, it's about dominance. And I think that that probably underpins most of it. And of course, then we've become conditioned to seeing it. Though there's been quite a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? People are becoming less comfortable with that, like on television. There are a lot of people who are saying that we don't want to see these kind of women's bodies, dead bodies laid out on slabs at the beginning of murder shows anymore. We don't want to see, the kind of raped teenage body lying in the woods. And violence against women is something which has been used for so long as titillation. And it's titillating for a number of reasons. It's titillating because I think we have an inherent sense that something is really wrong. And this, again, goes way back to our conditioning of, the women being weaker sex and men being the dominant sex. Something is really wrong if it's, for example, a young woman, if her life is squandered, because here's this young, kind of fertile woman. And there's something in our makeup that looks at that, regards that as being so anathema, so wrong, that's a good place to start a story, because you feel outrage. And it's a very basic trigger. But I think we have to question that. Like, we have to question all sorts of things. Like, we have to question the belief that Jack the Ripper just killed prostitutes. You know, certain things that we just take for granted, certain things that we just, you know, our knee-jerk responses. We have to start unpicking these things and questioning them. And I think, you know, this book is part of that conversation, I would hope.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Incredible. We've got one more question before we bring Book Club Live to a close. And this is, I've kind of put together two questions from Jane in Cambridge and from Wendy. Thank you both for your questions. And the question really is, how have attitudes towards sex workers and those dealing with addiction changed in the last 130 years?
Wow. I mean, gosh, I mean, I wish I could say that, you know, the change was like night and day, but it's not, and that's really desperately sad. I mean, I think a very good example of that, well, there are two very good examples of that. One is the Yorkshire Ripper. So almost exactly 100 years later, in the 1980s, you know, there were a series of killings, which the police handled so badly because they thought that a number of the women, well, the women who were killed were out at late at night by themselves. And therefore the perpetrator was almost certainly somebody who wanted to kill prostitutes, because these women were out in a not very savory part of town. And they let Peter Sutcliffe get away on several occasions because they thought he was after prostitutes. They thought the killer was after prostitutes. And that just goes to show this whole concept that, you know, we seem to think that bad women are out at night, that it's, you know, the whole language around the Yorkshire Ripper was absolutely disgraceful, you know, about, you know, people worried when a quote unquote decent girl was killed. My God, I mean, it's just horrible. So, I mean, that's 100 years' time. So, really, nothing had changed very much. And then we get the whole Suffolk Strangler murders, which I talk about in the final chapter of my book, where we find, I mean, this was, I think it was about 2007, I think, where we find the judge in the summing up of Steve Wright's case having to actually turn to a modern jury and saying, look, I want you to bear something in mind. It doesn't matter what these women did. It doesn't matter what drugs they took. It didn't matter what lifestyle they had. They did not deserve to be murdered. Now, the fact that a judge in the 21st century has to say this to jurors says so much about our very ingrained prejudice against sex workers, our assumptions, our beliefs about women, that women are asking for it. You know, I mean, we just have to keep trying to unpick these very deep rooted, deep seated beliefs that we have, in order to make our society a better place.
Oh, Hallie, and you have done so much of that unpicking and questioning with your extraordinary book, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper, which won the prestigious Baillie Gifford Prize. And I'm not surprised because it's wonderful. So on behalf of all of us at Book Club Live, thank you so much for giving us your time and to talk to us about your book. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really, really, really honored.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you, Hallie. It was wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your support of tonight's Book Club Live. A great chance to talk to Hallie, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. And I really hope you'll join us for another Book Club Live sometime. Thank you so much to everyone who sent in your questions and comments. There were so many. I'm so sorry if I didn't get to them. I tried to do as many as we possibly could. And I'm just so glad there is so much love for this book, because it really deserves it.
Thank you.
This Book Club Live is now closed. Bye.